Welcome to the McGuckin Group podcast. We are excited to have a couple of guests with us today. I'm your host, Audrey McGuckin, the CEO. But let's have our guests introduce themselves. Paul, let's have you go first.
Thank you so much, Audrey. I'm happy to be with you today. Paul Baldassari, I'm with Flex, responsible for global manufacturing and services. I'm also a university teacher by habit in Austria. So I'm very grateful to be with you today.
Yes, we all know the EMS industry. We all know the ups and downs, the rights and the lefts. But what we don't know is the stories. And so we're going to get into some stories today. Paul, big gratitude and thank you for making the time and joining us. You know, one of the things I wanted to start out with is I was on LinkedIn this morning and you and I have 500 plus common connections. Also, I've had a lot of conversations with our common connections and sometimes your name comes up. And what they say is, we love Paul. He's such an authentic leader. He has such a big freaking job at Flex, and yet he's human-centered. And yet he's a really great guy. And yet he's a really great leader. And I love to hear that. But one of the things I want to dig into is, where does that come from, right? Because we're going to talk about leadership and people and strategy and team, but the first thing we're going to talk about is you. And what I'd love to do, Paul, is give you some space to tell your story. Where were the moments of truth? Where did you grow up? What values did you take from your parents? What was it like? And so let me hand the microphone to you and let us have you take the floor and tell a little bit of your story.
Yeah, I'm first of all, I'm grateful for the feedback from people in the industry. And if there's one thing I think in this industry where we can really have an impact, it's about people, right? We all complain, about margins and ups and downs and customers asking for the impossible. But at the end, it's all people that make that possible. And we touch so many people that the one thing that is very different in this industry, I believe, is we can influence the lives, the work lives, but also the personal lives of hundreds of thousands of people in our companies and in our supply chains as well, right? We have people working in our factories and even living there in dormitories. So there are so many opportunities to do good and help people in the early stages of their careers. And that's what's really motivating me. And how the whole journey started is kind of a funny story. I'm always reminding myself on. I was 15 years old, and in Austria, you have to do a summer job in your industry to actually be able to advance to the next class. And I was working for a company that doesn't exist anymore, doing basically measurement devices on an S&D line. And after like a week, my boss told me that he's going on vacation now and he wants me to lead that manufacturing line. And I had 3 coworkers and I came in, 15 years, now I'm in charge. And I told everybody what to do. And the people were just standing there and say, no, we're not going to do that because what you tell us actually will not work. And I thought like, oh God, what am I going to do now? So I started to really get nervous and realizing, it's all about people and I have to provide value as a leader to the team. And I was only 15 years old, right? So I had like no clue what I was doing. So I sat down with everybody, listened to them, what they needed, what they thought, and then came up together with my 3 people team with a plan. Who is going to do what and how is that going to help us to actually provide a better result, but also have a more fun workplace? And suddenly everything started to click. And that was a huge learning for me that drove me for the rest of my career. As a leader, you have to provide value and you have to listen. and then everything becomes more fun and you become more successful as well.
Love that story. And what I heard you say is that was the moment where it clicked. And sometimes we'll use the term moments of truth or moments that matter. And we all have them in our lives, right? And that's what shapes us as our leader. But tell me about what traits you took from your parents before you were 15. What were the things that what were the traits that you got from growing up?
My parents have both been working very hard. My mom, she is a taskmaster still, right? She is now 84 years old and she's still driving and making sure everybody does what they need to do or what she believes we need to do, right? And sometimes it's not the same, and most of the times it's actually the same. And my dad worked actually in the electronic industry as well. So he got me interested very early in electronics, and he gave me like my first set of resistors and transistors, and I started to work with him on the first little radio and so on, and that triggered my interest for the industry, and that together with an interest later on in people realizing that we can only be successful together, formed my desire to work in Flex. When I was in university, and when I saw this company, I saw this kind of fulfills what I learned from my mom and what I learned from my dad, and actually provides me a lot of joy as well. And so that has been a pretty linear, I would say, career path for me. And I have 5 children. I'm hoping, and I see with many of them as well, that they have similar interests, right? They learn from us as their parents, and they also have their own interest. And the most happy place in life is when you can merge both of that and actually can have fun with a team and every day in your work life.
5 children. That's amazing. Tell me about some of the values that you are intentional about in instilling in your children.
Well, the most important one, and again, I learned this from my parents, is respect of others, right? We all come with different backgrounds, and we all have different needs at the moment and desires for the future, and to respect that and include that in the way that you work together, in the way that you deal with each other, is super important. And I see that with my kids as well. My oldest one, my daughter, she wants to become a medical doctor, and the boys are also in very different fields. But what I feel for them in common as well, that they value and respect others for their ideas and for their background. And that's what makes life fun, right? Listening and learning from others. And we sometimes, when we come together as a family, we often talk about, their experience and my experience. And I can always hear this curiosity about learning about other cultures, other needs and states of people where they are in. And I'm actually very proud because the older ones already do volunteer work, and I can see that that comes from their heart, right? That's something that is very intrinsic, motivating them.
I want to double down on this thing around it comes from their heart. What I mean by that is you can't fake great leadership because people smell it a mile away. People smell it a mile away. And I think, some of the words that people use when they talk about you, Paul, when you come up in conversations, is this big idea of authenticity. And when you can bring your whole self to work, I'm looking at some of the notes I've been scratching down here. You said in EMS, we get to impact hundreds of thousands of people's lives. And if you can't show up authentically, then we're doing them a disservice. But authenticity requires vulnerability. It requires you to be able to tell your story. And vulnerability requires courage. And that's not always first and foremost for leaders. One of I'm going to say he's my favorite CEO because he is. One of my favorite CEOs was Don Sharon. God rest his soul, at Kimball. I don't know if you ever got to spend any time with Don. He was such an authentic leader. He had a high say-do ratio. And when we first started working with him, he said, Audrey, we need the McGuckin Group to help us with our people strategy. He said, also, I have to go to church every Sunday. And really what he meant was, I want you to help us with our people strategy, but it has to be respectful. I heard you using that word, Paul, right? You know, it has to be, you know, you have to value and respect others. And that's what Don was saying. We've got some big moves to make in Kimball, but we have to do it valuing and respecting others.
I can't agree more with you, you know, especially in our industry, we have many times to make tough decisions, right? Our business is going up, but it's also going down, right? And we have to make tough people decisions. And if you do that in a way where you communicate openly to people and explain, you know, why you have to take the decision, and it is difficult, and there are no easy decisions, but you do that with acknowledging what everybody is going through and helping in an honest way as much as you can, then you can stay true as a leader to what's needed for the business and continue to be a good leader for the people as well, right? And support people. And I've seen many times, you know, when we get into tough situations that people start to get concerned about, you know, talking about the difficult problems in public. But the worst thing you can do is that you don't address those right away with the larger audience, because people want to know what's going on. And normally everybody is very strong in understanding and taking and accepting the consequences when they are spoken about openly. And when, as you said, right, you stay true to your words and decisions and your overall vision and mission. If you start to make too many compromises and you know deviate from what's right, then things get much more difficult. Maybe not in the short run, but in the long run, if you deviate from what you as a person believe is important and are your core values, you cannot be a good leader and you cannot succeed in your business requirements.
Yes. And here's some of the sacred cows that we like to slay. What I mean by that is the objections. We'll get objections from people that say, you can't do that in Europe. They're very conservative. Or you can't do that in Mexico. Or you can't do that in Taiwan. Or you can't do that in China. And here's what I would tell you, that from our experience, having lived in Asia, having lived in Europe, and having worked all over the world, the one thing that's true for all leaders is when you can show up as your authentic self with transparency, it generates engagement that you've never seen in your life. You know, we have an amazing client. I'm going to talk about them. I'm hoping they're okay with it. It's USI, and USI is in Guad, and their headquarters are in Taiwan. Well, we went and spent time with the executive team in Taiwan. All of them were probably over 60 and Taiwanese. And, you know, before we got on the plane, people said, Audrey, I don't know if your work's going to have the same impact. I don't know if you can get to the real meat of this authenticity. And here's what I'll tell you. That's not true. Those executives showed up, they were transparent, they were vulnerable, and they had an experience that will never leave their lives before. But let me pause there, Paul. I know you would want to hop in.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. I mean, I've same experience in China and Mexico and most of the countries in Europe, right, that I've had the opportunity to work in. Authenticity and leadership that stays true to your values actually is the same all over the world. And it's also the same about generations, right? There is a lot of talk about, millennials have a different view on life and their careers and so on. Actually, if you look at it, yes, people have different needs during their career, but that's the same for each generation. I had different needs in my career in my early stages, right? We started to found a family, we had very young kids, and that's the same for many millennials now as well. But at the end, we all have the same desires, and most of that is about staying true to who we are as a person and being able to be the best in work and in our personal life.
Yeah.
And that's the real virtue, I would say, of leadership, to enable your team to be the best that they can.
Yes. I think you named one of the other myths that, oh, you have to treat Gen X differently to Gen Z, different to millennials. No, we just have to focus on deeply personalizing the experience. I have twin 21-year-old daughters. Both of them have wildly different needs. Hannah is very focused. She's very process oriented. And she has different needs to Emily, who's the same generation, but she's more gregarious and outgoing. Emily suffers from anxiety, and that led to depression, which led to suicidal thoughts. And nobody ever imagined that that would be Emily's story. And so you see, what we can't do is we can't assume. We can't assume that we know somebody's story until we ask what somebody's story is. And to ask for somebody's story, we have to tell our story.
I very, very much agree with you. And that's the other part of being a leader, right? Is listening and being outgoing and vulnerable. And the other one is as well to listen to our people and actually to all stakeholders and make sure that people are able to tell their story and that their story is heard of and appreciated of. And only then we can be open and working together well as a team, right? When we understand where we are. And that's a little bit the challenge I see, right? With Zoom and not having in-person meetings, right? To understand where people are right now. We turn on our computers, right? And we have these nice backgrounds, right? I'm in the mountains right now. And in reality, I'm sitting in the office, it's Friday afternoon. I do enjoy our conversation, but you don't have the leveling anymore. Like everybody is coming to the same room. You smell the same environment. You came from the same, outside environment. You're at the same time zone. So everybody is getting like ready for lunch or for dinner, or whatever else. And we have to be very specific to take the time, especially in online meetings as well. So when I have a meeting that is important, I do take the time, 1 or 2 or 3 minutes, at least for everybody to tell where they are right now. So what's top on their mind at the moment from a work perspective, as well as from their personal life perspective. And then suddenly you see how everybody calibrates and how the team connects, yeah, rather than staying on a very superficial level on pure factual problem that you try to solve. And
Yes.
we know from science, right? 90% of our brain is subconscious. So the 10% that focus logically on the task, yeah, are not in control. You need to get the full 100% calibrated and into the room to be successful as a team.
That's right. I love that. And it's about, how do I bring my whole self to the equation? When we're in EMS, we're talking about EBITDA, we're talking about profit, we're talking about revenue, we're talking about numbers, we're talking about first pass yields. Don't come to me with a problem unless you've got the data. And yet the thing that makes us different as a leader is this human-centered approach of, we're all coming at this from a different space. And one of the values I have is be kind. Now, you could interpret that in so many ways, but my mum taught me from a very early age, which is treat others as though you would want to be treated. and never assume what's going on in anybody's life. So always be kind. And so my headline for my value is be kind, but the texture underneath it is really about coming from this place of you don't know what anyone's got going on in their life. And, you know, recently I got to experience that firsthand with my daughters. And so that made me a different person. One of the other myths, Paul, around this work is you either have it or you haven't, and it's not teachable. And what I would say is you can teach it, but the only way you can teach it is if people are prepared to be vulnerable, if people are prepared to tell their story. We had a client in Mexico. There were 18 men in the room. We did some of our human-centered work, and we had them tell their story. And one of the things we say is, in times of possibilities, leaders go last. That means when you're brainstorming, you go last, Paul. In times of vulnerability, leaders go first. What that means is to set the tone, you are the one that sets the tone. When we were with those leaders in Mexico, the GM set the tone. And he said, here's my story. And, you know, my sister, and she got very sick and she died, and everybody in the room was crying. And then the next person told their story about what that meant to them. And so that's this idea of you can teach it if you can create the right conditions.
That's very powerful, right? First, like you said, right? As a leader, you need to set the tone, and you need to open the environment that everybody can be open about their own vulnerability. I can totally relate to that. And those moments create that powerful connection in the team that you can then talk about, you know, everything else, right? Everything that you need to solve as a team becomes much easier once you're calibrated on where everybody is.
Exactly. When people see this podcast title, they'll see Paul Baldassari Flex, and they'll see Audrey McGuckin from the McGuckin Group, and they will probably assume that we're going to talk about EBITDA. We're going to talk about first price yields. We're going to talk about hiring. No, what we're actually talking about here is leadership, and that really matters. And Paul, as we close out here, and as you think about young leaders coming up after you, as you think about your 5 kids, as you think about the young leaders at Flex, what would be the 1 or 2 pieces of advice that you would have as they step into this work of leadership?
I found 2 areas most important. One is, as a leader, you need to add value to your team. Take the time, understand where your team is right now, like we just talked, and see what does the team need. Is it something that you can provide yourself? Is it something that you can bring into the team? The strongest teams are diverse teams, right? Where you have the diversity of thought and the diversity of background and capabilities and everything. But normally a team has some area, right, that is kind of the bottleneck. Is it, you know, like they need a taskmaster, or they need someone very strategic, or they need someone who knows has a special capability in some technology, whatever, right? And making the team whole is the virtue of the leader. And the second part actually plays into that, and that is listening. Don't go into any meetings with assumptions. Don't go in with the assumption you already know what needs to be done. There is a saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I have a personal story I want to share about it. Earlier in my career, I got the responsibility for social and environmental responsibility. And we had our dormitories in China, and when I visited those, I saw that, you know, we had at that time bunk beds with plywood on top, right? So there were no mattresses. And I got immediately angry on the GM and said, you know, you need to buy mattresses. This is not okay, right? And he wanted to explain me, and I didn't listen. Because my intention was, I'm doing good to all of our people that are in dormitories. but I actually had no clue why it was that way. And what I didn't know is every year in February, the warm, humid air comes from the sea to like South China, and the buildings are still cold. And if there is no air condition, the water actually condenses on the ceilings and drops down on the floor, right? So if you have a mattress, the mattress gets moist and cold, and our people hated it. And I got back to the same site a couple of weeks later, and I got close to the factory, and I already saw like a lot of like foam pieces flying around in the air and on the street and so on. What happened is people got, they didn't like the mattresses. They basically threw them out of the window, and they were like blowing all around in the city. And not only did I waste everybody's time, but I also wasted about $500,000 in mattresses. And my boss at the time, he was a very kind person. He didn't fire me, but he told me one thing: you better listen to the locals before you make any decisions. And even if you mean well, you still have to listen, because you will learn something and you will actually make a better result for everybody. And that was such an important lesson for me. That's the one thing when people ask me what makes a good leader: 2 ears, one mouth.
Thank you for sharing where you screwed up. That's one of the traits of authentic leaders is, this is where I made a mistake. This is where I screwed up. Not everybody's willing to do that. Not everybody is willing to share their mistake. So thank you. The other thing is, just a quick story. When we lived in Asia, my daughter went to stay with her Japanese friends, and she came back and said, "Oh, I had a terrible night's sleep. There was no mattress on the bed." But when I spoke to the parents said, "Yeah, that's for health reasons. We think that the mattress doesn't do well for your back." And so that was a big learning moment for her as well. So as we close out, Paul, thank you for sharing your perspective. Thank you for sharing, your values and how you grew up, and thank you for sharing some of your mistakes. What's the final thing that you would leave our viewers and our listeners with?
So for whoever thinks about, for the future of the career, EMS is a crazy industry, but it's also a very rewarding one. You can impact hundreds of thousands of people's lives, help them in their early career stages. And while, other industries, you make probably more profit, in this industry, you have an agile environment where you can try out a lot of different things. And we also produce products that make people's lives better. So I can only recommend you, if you are looking for an adventure and you want to do good for human mankind, think about if you want to go into this industry, because you have all the opportunities to do well.
Yes. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for joining us. We are excited to share this with our viewers and listeners, and you can follow us at www.McGuckinGroup.com.